Okay.
All right. Let me just post it real quick.
Okay.
All right. And looks like Ben won't be joining us tonight. It's all right, though. All right. Fabulous. All right. So we are at place and motion again. But after today, we should be good and caught up. I didn't make any notes, and so this will be entirely off the cuff. Sorry about that. So, just to recapitulate what we were talking about before, we went through space and time and talked about that. And now we're at place. Um, I am so far from being entirely coherent. I apologize.
It's all right. If we need to pause, that's fine too.
All right, so let's just dive in. I'll read 260. Um, Space is within itself the contradiction of indifferent asunderness. That means differentiation, basically, and differenceless continuity. The pure negativity of itself and the transition, first of all, into time. Similarly, time is the immediate collapse into indifference, into undifferentiated asunderness, or space, because its opposed moments, which are held together in unity, immediately sublate themselves. In this way, the negative determination in space, the exclusive point, no longer only implicitly or in itself conforms to the notion, but is posited and concrete within itself through the total negativity, which is time. The point, as thus concrete, is place. So, place is the unity of here and now. It's basically what the first Zusatz tells us. And um, I'll just read 261 because it seems pretty self-explanatory, or maybe not. Place as this posited unity, posited identity of space and time is equally at first the posited contradiction which space and time are each in themselves. Place is spatial and therefore indifferent singularity, and is this only as a spatial now as time, so that place is immediately indifferent towards itself as this place is external to itself, the negation of itself, and is another place. This vanishing and self regeneration of space in time and of time in space, a process in which time posits itself spatially as place, but in which place too, as indifferent spatiality, is immediately posited as temporal. This is motion. This becoming, however, is itself just as much the collapse within itself of its contradiction, the immediately identical and existent unity of both, namely matter. Okay, so we've gone from space time to place, and and now we have motion and matter. And I wanted to focus, since this is our second time through, on this idea because I think it's really crucial to understand what's going on in Hegel's system, because right now you're looking at these categories, right? But you're also thinking of the real world and you're wondering what's the connection? How can I think about the connection? It's very difficult to do that. And so he says right there in the remark, the transition from ideality, In other words, the ideas we have about things around us, to reality, from abstraction to concrete existence, in this case, from space and time to reality. And you're thinking, well, space and time are reality. Well, space and time are ideas about reality that we, think
You
about, write down.
tell the story.
Yeah, we tell the story about reality through these categories of space and time, is what he's saying, which appears, the reality which appears as matter is incomprehensible to the understanding. And by that, he means Verstand. He means well, if perception is commonplace or common sense, the understanding is the more three-dimensional version, I guess you could say, of common sense. It's what people usually use to do basic reasoning, every day in their lives, and is one short of what Hegel calls speculative reasoning, which is a level higher in the logic. And he talks about it in the logic, but also in the phenomenology. And he says, consequently, the transition always presents itself to the understanding as an external affair, as something already given. And if you look at your textbooks, this is kind of how reality is dealt with in science. It's sort of, the categories are already given, and you just sort of work with them. And
That's an empirical way of generating
yeah,
it.
yeah. But the way that Hegel says it is that all of the categories, all of the things that you sort of relate to each other are all external to each other. It's not presented in its necessity or its internal logic. And if that sounds foreign to you, you're not alone. Most of us growing up in the U.S., science textbooks are exactly like this. They're all presented sort of arbitrarily, I guess you could say. Um, so yeah. So he says, it is said of matter that it is composite. This refers to its abstract asunderness to space. Insofar as abstraction is made from time and all forms generally, it is asserted that matter is eternal and immutable. It is said also that it is impenetrable and offers resistance, is tangible, visible, and so on. These predicates signify nothing else than that matter exists, partly for specific forms of perception, in general for an other, and partly that it exists just as much for itself. Both these determinations belong to matter precisely because it is the identity of space and time, of immediate asunderness, and of negativity or self-subsistent singularity, he says. So he says the transition of ideality into reality is explicitly demonstrated in the familiar mechanical phenomena, namely that ideality can take the place of reality and vice versa, and only the notionless thinking of the imagination and the understanding are to blame, basically common sense, if the identity of both is not inferred from their interchangeability. And then he goes on to talk about how it could be demonstrated that ideality and reality are related. So he talks about the lever. Distance can take the place of mass and vice versa. And here, for those of you remembering from your physics class, distance and mass are part of a particular formula. I couldn't cite it for you or draw it on a chalkboard. Kyle might be able to. I'm not sure. Uh,
Lever, not level.
lever. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I'm just reading off the screen. Um, and a quantum of ideal moment produces the same effect as the corresponding real amount. Similarly, in connection with the magnitude of motion, velocity, which is simply the quantitative relationship of space and time, can take the place of mass. And conversely, the real effect is the same if the mass is increased and the velocity proportionally decreased, right?
That's momentum. Momentum. So
Yeah.
sorry.
It's the equation I think that makes sense here is that force times the distance equals a certain torque. So
Yeah.
that's the inverse relationship where one goes up, the other goes down. So they take the place of the other in that way.
Yeah.
Also, it's kind of pointed understanding is the thing that continually holds things apart, right?
Yes. Yes, it is.
And
Eh,
I'll see more of that soon, man. So
Oh, yeah.
for pointing that
Yeah.
out. I forgot that was the next chapter after perception.
hmm Yeah, and he talks about force here, a category of reflection fixed by the understanding, which presents itself here as ultimate and prevents the understanding from inquiring further into the relationship of its categories. It's very interesting to me actually because force is a major category for Newton. Uh, let's see. Yeah, and this is the big thing at the bottom. He says it is also in keeping with this notionless reflection, basic, you know, common sense scientific, textbook in school, that the so-called forces are regarded as implanted in matter. That is to say, as originally external to it, with the result that this very identity of space and time, which is vaguely present in the reflective category of force, and it's very vague, by the way, almost sounds like magic, and which in truth constitutes the essence of matter, is posited as something alien to it and contingent, something introduced into it from outside. And again, Kyle, you said that the understanding likes to hold things apart. I think this is part of that as well.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
think as soon as I connected it, this my mental perception of this got a lot clearer.
Yeah.
'Cause I can,
Um, Hegel says place is simply the universal here. So again, it's very helpful if you're reading the phenomenology to review sense certainty and perception, because being able to talk about the here and the now, those are very much covered in phenomenology as experiential. When you're looking at the object of sense certainty, the object of perception, and when you're trying to bring into focus the early, well, any category really of nature, as pertains to this subject looking at the object, this is very much germane, I guess you could say. And he goes into talking about there are three different places: the present place, the place about to be occupied, and the place which has just been vacated. And this reminds me of the earlier. It's interesting actually because it almost sounds like time, right? Because before, space, undifferentiated space, went on forever, and even if you found a point, space just goes on past that point, right? It's continuous, but also it's three dimensional. And now we're looking at place, and place, in having sublated time, takes on some of its characteristics. So you remember with time, it was now, it was in the past, and it was in the future. And if you look at place, it has three different places. Then he says, but at the same time, there is only one place, a universal of these places, which remains unchanged through all the changes. And so, if you remember your sense certainty, turning out its object turning out to be a universal, this kind of gets to what we're talking about here. Only now, it isn't the point of view of the object of experience and the I experiencing the object in the phenomenology, but looking specifically at reality and the sort of what makes up what's eventually here going to be defined as matter in a few minutes. But before we get there, we get to notion or motion, I should say. Sorry, a universal of these but at the same time, there's only one place, a universal of these places, which remains unchanged through all the changes. It is duration, existing immediately in accordance with its notion, and as such, it is motion. It is in motion that space and time first acquire actuality. So, just to recapitulate, reality exists, matter exists, and motion exists. Hegel knows this. But at this level of abstraction, we're not yet done deriving actuality in its fullness. And the first time that it emerges within the logical proof here is at this point in motion. So, motion as actuality pertains to matter, but matter, I think it's the first determinate reality. I, I can't remember exactly. Is that right, Kyle?
Say it again, sorry.
Uh, matter is the first determinate reality of nature. Is that right?
Sure.
Okay.
Determinate reality. I guess it is the first thing that remains. Yeah, it's the first determinacy that's consistent.
Right.
Rather than just defining just the flow or whatever, or kind of what's there. It is the actual thing that's static in some way. Even though
Yeah.
it's becoming, it's the universal, as you say.
Yeah. Now, Hegel here, and this is interesting to me because he says, we're accustomed to regarding motion as a predicate or a state, but motion is, in fact, the self, the subject as subject, the abiding of vanishing. The fact that motion appears as a predicate is the immediate necessity of its self extinction. So basically, motion is the natural version of becoming from the logic, basically. That's what that sounds like to me, because becoming had, a vanishing and a coming to be, right? So the fact that motion, sorry, okay. The restoration of the duration of the point, as opposed to its motion, is the restoration of place as unmoved. But this restored place is not immediate place, but place which is returned out of alteration and is the resultant ground of motion, as forming a dimension, i.e., or for example, as opposed to the other movements, it is the center. So, yeah. And then he goes on, this return of the line is the circle. It is the now, before, and after, which have closed together in a unity in which these dimensions are indifferent, so that before is equally after and vice versa. Circular motion is the spatial or subsistent unity of the dimensions of time. The point proceeds toward a place which is its future and leaves one which is the past. But what it has left behind is at the same time what it has still to reach. It has been already at the place which it is reaching. Its goal is the point which is its past. And this is the truth of time, that the goal is not the future, but the past. It's a very interesting statement.
Well, that's like I think I said before. That's teleology in the form of actual time. The
Yes.
creates is I keep getting the exact phrase is here like they're both P proposes. It's presuppose. Nah, I forget. I got to go look at the logic again. But the past, presupposes over the future. What is the word? Sorry, it's that it knows the future. Like it creates the future, while the past is presupposed, or the future is presupposed by the past. It's that same kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that reciprocal relationship
Mhm.
that it
And
has.
there's since and then what is it? They're interconnected through the present.
Yes. Yeah. The present is their unity.
It is their synthesis. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and then he starts talking about the plane. I didn't exactly understand the plane part. The motion which relates itself to the center is itself the plane. Motion as the synthetic whole in which exists its moments, the extinction of the motion in the center, the motion itself and its relation to its extinction, namely the radii of the circle. I keep trying to think of like a joystick and how you would like, back in the day you have a joystick and you would have to calibrate it so that you could use it on the old computers. It didn't happen automatically. And so I keep thinking about like the center and the radii and so forth. But this plane itself moves and becomes the other of itself, a complete space, or the reversion into self, the immobile center, becomes a universal point in which the whole is peacefully absorbed. In other words, it is motion in its essence, motion which has sublated the distinctions of now, before, and after, its dimensions, or its notion. In the circle, they are in unity. The circle is the restored notion of duration, motion extinguished within itself. There is posited mass, the persistent, the self-consolidated, which exhibits motion as its possibility. Okay. All right, and then he gives a rundown of finite mechanics, and its components. Now this is how we conceive the matter. He says, since there is motion, something moves, but the something which persists is matter. Space and time are filled with matter. Space does not conform to its notion. It is therefore the notion of space itself which gives itself existence in matter. Matter has often been made the starting point, and even to today it is. And space and time have then been regarded as forms of it. What is right in this standpoint is that matter is what is real in space and time. But these, being abstract, must present themselves here as the first, and then it must appear that matter is their truth. So he's basically running down the order, the logical order, from abstract to concrete um, that we have to justify matter by, right?
Mm.
Just as there is no motion without matter, so too there is no matter without motion. Motion is the process, the transition of time into space and of space into time. Matter, on the other hand, is the relation of space and time as a peaceful identity. And that reminds me in the logic of the determinate being, which is the peaceful identity of being and nothing.
With the becoming of something.
Yeah, well, exactly. The motion. Hang on. Motion is in nature what becoming is in the logic. So matter and its, what do you call it? Its potentiality for motion is the same thing as determinate being, which has the potentiality of becoming and of passing away. Wow. Okay, I think I understand the logic a little better in that light because it's easier to picture matter. Um, I'm not going to say pass away because it doesn't it doesn't really pass away, you know. Um, ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Because mass is what's the word? Mass is
Observed.
preserved. Yeah, so it's either matter or it's energy, but and there's that conversion, but it doesn't just disappear into nothing. Um, but it moves, and it's moving as it's becoming, or it's passing away. It passes away in space. In other words, it moves both in space and in time, and that's its version of becoming. So it doesn't pass away. It just moves in space and time. Okay, I know I just said that, but
Yeah, that's 19th century physics.
it's it's messing with my brain because I'm trying to imagine the matter disappearing like the
20th
determined.
century physics, it can't matter can disappear. becomes energy,
Yeah.
and vice versa.
There's a large similarity between place here and say like a world line and other such in physics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is perpetuation of something through space time, and so of course it's no longer it's again it does yeah it is yeah
Yeah.
I
I don't know
mean,
nothing else to add to that.
Hegel was also in this. He's developing a critique of Newtonian physics,
Mhm.
which cannot, I mean, this critique cannot be fully realized in the 19th century because Newtonian physics was the best it had, but in the 20th century, it's a different story.
Totally. I'm just going to finish reading this part off real quick. So he says, matter is the first reality, existent being for self. There it is, what I said earlier. It is not merely the abstract being, the ideality, but the positive existence of space, which, however, excludes other spaces. In other words, if there's a rock, there can't be another rock there, or it's two rocks basically hitting together. The point should also be exclusive, but because it is only an abstract negation, in other words, the point in space, it does not yet exclude. The point would not exclude of movement through a point in space because behind it is space, right? Matter is exclusive relation to self and is thus the first real limit in space. It's got a, yeah. What is called the filling of space and time, the palpable and tangible, what offers resistance and what in its being for other is also for itself. And all this is attained simply in the unity of space and time. So there's matter. So for those watching, what we've done here so far is filled out. So the result, the logical result of space and time as place and motion and mass is matter itself. And matter is capable of existing in space and time in a place, right? Kind of running this down, and it's capable of motion. Okay. And that's all we know about it right now because that's the order we're going in. And we know from our science textbooks that, you know, you look anywhere, I mean, even on Earth, you don't necessarily have to think of like outer space, but even right in front of you, there's matter, like this mouse, right? And it excludes other matter because it's solid. It has a limit, it has a border, so on and so forth. And it's capable of motion, of existing in space and time, and it has mass, you know, and yeah, and that's it. And so we go into finite mechanics, and finite mechanics is basically what it is capable of under those circumstances. And so he gets into talking about its characteristics, what it's capable of. And he derives gravity from the categories of repulsion and attraction, which we saw in the logic previously. And gravity itself isn't even necessarily material at all, according to Hegel, but it does create an ideal singularity, a center. And he talks about Kant starting toward a concept of matter, an actual speculative concept of matter. The only problem is that he uses the already available categories and holds them apart, basically lets the understanding hold sway. And so the attraction and repulsion are mutual opposites to Kant, unfortunately. And then Hegel says, look, matter combines those two in reality. Like you can't deny that. if you look at the physical principles. And the physical principles demonstrate the necessity of their mutual interpenetration of attraction and repulsion. He says, only heavy matter is that totality in real existence in which attraction and repulsion can occur. It possesses the ideal moments of the notion of singularity or subjectivity. For this reason, attraction and repulsion are not to be taken as independent of each other or as forces on their own account. Matter results from them only as moments of the notion, in other words, the notion of matter, but it is the presupposition of their manifestation, right? The characteristics of matter, right? It is essential to distinguish gravity from mere attraction. And I find this very interesting because gravity is actually a more complicated category than just mere attraction. The latter, attraction, is only the sublating of discreteness and yields only continuity. Gravity, on the other hand, is the reduction of both discrete and continuous particularity to unity as a negative relation to self. Basically, that they're both combined within matter, to singularity, to subjectivity, which, however, is still quite abstract. Let's see. Blah, 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 blah. So he talks about singularity, but the fact that it's still an ideal category. Gravity constitutes the substantiality of matter. This itself is the nisus. I'm not familiar with that word. The striving to reach the center. And yeah. But, and this is the other essential determination of matter, this center falls outside it. It can be said that matter is attracted by the center, i.e., its existence as a self-external continuum is negated. But if the center itself is conceived as material, then the attraction is merely reciprocal, is at the same time a being attracted, so that the center again exists in distinction from them both. The center, however, is not to be taken as material. For the we usually think of gravity as a force, and it's sort of immaterial, but also an effect of heavy matter, right? The characteristic of the material object is precisely to posit its center outside itself. It is not the center, but the striving to reach it, which is immanent in matter. Gravity is, so to speak, the confession of the nullity of the self-externality of matter in its being for self, of its lack of self-subsistence, of its contradiction. So, where the center lies is determined by the heavy matter of which is at the center. Matter as mass is determinate, and so also, therefore, is its nicest, which is the
Goal, yeah. Or its exact phrasing I looked up is an effort or striving toward a particular goal or attainment.
yeah,
But it is funny looking back at this form of gravity. Again, this is like what we say in science is that mass causes space-time to curve.
yes,
Therefore, that's the actual force. Is just it's free. It's more moving. It's not force from outside. It's just its nature is it's moving with space time, right? But it's
yeah.
manipulating space time.
It's
Yeah.
falling down that curve that it creates.
Yeah.
Because in Newton's concept of gravity, practically from the very beginning, a lot of people criticize it because of positive action at a distance.
Yes.
Well, Leibniz was criticized Newton for that, and lots of people did actually.
Didn't Descartes take up action at a distance?
There's no notions about that. So
Okay. All right. Yeah. So, so So there's the Zusatz for um, finite mechanics, and um, basically he runs down what matter is and it does, talking about the many and the one. And a lot of this language reminds me of the phenomenology of spirit, especially. Um, uh, and gravity. And I'm not going to go through it all because um, I don't feel qualified to, honestly. Uh, but if you read through it logically, it seems sound. At the end of it, he says, accordingly, the second sphere which we have now to consider is finite mechanics. And so basically, at the end of before this part, he rounds out his discussion of what matter is capable of and why. And now he says, uh, finite mechanics, because here matter still does not conform to its notion. This finitude of matter lies in the separation between motion and matter as such. In other words, matter is finite insofar as its life, i.e., motion, is external to it. The body is at rest, or else motion is communicated to it from outside. This is the first difference in matter as such. This difference is then sublated by the nature of matter by gravity. Here, therefore, we have the three determinations of finite mechanics. First, inert matter. Second, thrust. And thirdly, the motion of falling, which forms the transition to absolute mechanics, where matter in its existence too conforms to the notion. Gravity belongs to matter not only in itself, but insofar as the in itself is already manifested. This is falling, where consequently gravity will first make its appearance. So basically, matter in its existence and its possibility has already been defined, but it's a matter's ability to traverse the three-dimensional plane in and of itself, I think, is what is defined here. And so between being inert, capable of being moved through thrust, and of falling is sort of the filling out of its of its mechanical ability in finite space. I think that's what he's getting at. So um and so he starts with inert matter.
Yeah.
Have you guys how far have you guys read in finite mechanics? Did you read to the end
think I'm
or hmm?
I think I'm in the last commentary.
Okay. All right. I finished it off myself, but I can't say that I could teach it to someone and just sort of rattle it off. Um, um,
I'm just trying to think. This is the part where we have makes there's no determinate distinction between something in stable motion, which I guess is constant velocity, and something at rest,
yeah.
which again matches what we've seen experimentally. Uh,
Well, at this point, inertness and rest are not the same thing. Um, Maybe we should just read it through and then
because it's inert that even at the quality of inertness is through any kind of motion, the stable motion, including none.
right.
No, not acceleration, because that
Yeah,
requires something additional.
right. Um, So yeah, I'll just read through some of this. Matter is simply universal and immediate, has at first only a quantitative difference, and is particularized into different quanta or masses, which in the superficial determination of a whole or a one are bodies. The body too is immediately distinguished from its ideality. It is essentially spatial and temporal, but as being in space and in time, and it appears as their content indifferent to this form. So basically, at this point, inert matter is being filled out logically as abstractly as it can be. Like you could have an asteroid, you could have a school, you could have a pin, right? And at this point, they're all the same at this level of abstraction, if that makes sense. Matter-filled space. This simply means that it is a real limit in space because as a being for self, it is exclusive, as space as such is not. With being for self, there at once enters the determination of plurality, a difference, however, which is quite indeterminate. It is not yet a difference of matter in its own self. Material bodies are mutually exclusive. So it's a very abstract description of matter at this point. Any matter would do to fit the description. In accordance with the spatial determination in which time is sublated, the body endures. Makes sense. And in accordance with the temporal determination in which indifferent spatial existence is sublated, it is transitory. In general, it is a wholly contingent one. It could be any one piece of matter. It is indeed the unity which holds together the two moments in their opposition, i.e., motion, but because the body is indifferent to space and time, and so to their relation motion, the latter is external to it, as is also rest, the negation of motion in body. The body is inert. So there it is. The body is only the abstract, immediate unity of time and space, but the developed and restless unity motion is not here posited as a unity immanent in it. This is the character given to body by ordinary mechanics, which postulates as an axiom that a body is set in motion or comes to rest only through an external cause, motion or rest constituting only a state of that body. But here we have only immediate materiality, which for that very reason is only abstract and finite. So he's basically starting to relate it to Newtonian mechanics. Let's see here. In mass is immediately. So he talks about resistance, duration. Mass itself is neither at rest nor in motion, but only passes from one state to the other through an external impulse. In other words, rest and motion are posited in it by an other.
Yeah, so it's in that sense, it's that kind of motion is indifferent because it requires an other to happen. Yeah.
Yes,
And that's the other word I was trying to remember is posited, so it presupposes the other direction.
exactly.
But yeah, that's like, oh yeah, it's projected. So motion itself, so this kind of motion is projected onto the body rather than being inert in it, which is because we're only seeing it at an abstract level.
Well, if you think about it, we're thinking about the idea of matter and matter in motion. And at that level, at the level of abstraction we're at, a
Mhm.
change in the matter, we don't have enough information to say that the matter is capable of motion in and of itself through its gravity, right? That
Mhm.
hasn't been posited yet. And I think it's underlined by this statement that's at the very end of the page itself says, in itself, matter is inert, i.e., matter as its notion, opposed to its reality. So, really, at this level of abstraction, we're really just talking about the idea of matter and not the reality that is matter,
Mhm.
which he takes pains to differentiate throughout nature, throughout the philosophy of nature. Um, and then he moves on to thrust. And thrust. I want to see if I made any notes. I don't know if I did. Not many. Um, the inert body, I'll just read it out. The inert body, externally set in motion, hence a finite motion, and so connected with another body, momentarily constitutes with this other one body, for they are only quantitatively distinguished masses. In this way, there's a single motion of both bodies, communication of motion. But equally, the bodies offer resistance to each other, since each is likewise presupposed as an immediate one. So when I read this section, I immediately thought of two asteroids hitting each other, right? One's going this way, one's going this way, and they hit each other. And at that point, right, the bodies offer resistance to each other since each is likewise yeah.
That's attraction up until repulsion.
Yeah, and they affect each other. And his whole description through this section talks about the abstraction of that process, I guess you could say. So matter is capable of this stuff happening. And you could talk about it at this level of abstraction. But in the end, if you're looking for an empirical version of it, and I'm sure he's not thinking of two asteroids hitting each other because Star Trek wasn't invented yet. So, it's a very abstract description, I guess you could say. And he says, weight is the heaviness of a quantitatively distinctive mass. This weight is the real determinateness, together with the ideal or the quantitative determinateness of motion of velocity constitutes a single determinateness. So he's bringing together the weight and the velocity of the asteroids to show you, how this is going to work. Hang on just a second.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, sorry, weight and velocity come into their own when two bodies collide. And he says the second moment from this standpoint of finite mechanics is that matter is set in motion, and in this motion forms contact with itself. Now, because matter is indifferent to place, it follows that it is also set in motion. This is contingent, and I love this because he starts to talk about the contingent and the necessary. This is contingent, but here every necessary moment is posited in the moment in the mode of contingency. Later on, we shall see that the motion of matter in the sphere of existence is necessary too. In the thrust of two bodies on each other, both are to be regarded as moving themselves, for it is the struggle for one and the same place. In other words, their collision point, you could call it. The body exerting thrust takes the place of the body at rest, and this, the one being pushed, is retaining its place and therefore moves too in its effort to reoccupy the place taken up by the other. But there is no empty space between the bodies, which are thrusting and pressing against each other. They are in contact, and it is in this contact now that the ideality of matter begins. And the interest lies in seeing how this inwardness of matter emerges into existence, just as the attainment of existence by the notion is always the interesting thing. That's an interesting way to put that, I guess. The picture in my head of what's going on and what Hegel is trying to express are probably two different things. I'm realizing. And then he goes on to say, thus two masses come into contact, that is to say, are for each other, in relation to each other, is what he's saying. This means that there are two material points or atoms coinciding in a single point or in an identity. Their being for self is not a being for self. No matter how hard and brittle the matter is imagined to be, one can imagine that there is still some space between them, but as soon as they touch each other, they exist as one body, however small this point is conceived to be. So they're turned into a system when they collide.
That's what I was like, just hit me too. So
Yeah. Um, it's not external and merely spatial, but it's real. Similarly, the point of time is a unity of past and future. The 2 points are in one, and at the same time, they are also not in one. Motion is precisely this, to be in one place, and at the same time, to be in another place, and yet not to be in another place, but only in this place. I'm not sure I understand that.
I think it's just motion to be at one place at the same time. And I think it's just kind of redescribed that motion is this sort of movement through space time.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. You know, and he goes on to describe the process, including the elasticity of matter, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and I'm, yeah, and I'm sort of thinking about something and an other, which is also a something. But honestly, with mechanics, it's probably more complicated than that. Um, ooh, this is interesting. The ideality of being for self consists in this, that an other prevails in the body, and the body also prevails in this other. This determination of ideality, which seems to come from outside, shows itself to be the very essence of matter, an essence which at the same time belongs to matter's inwardness. This is the reason why physics turns to the conception of force, a category of reflective thought. The intensity of thrust as magnitude of the effect is simply that through which matter preserves its being for self or resists. For thrust is equally resistance. Resistance, however, simply means matter. What resists is material, and conversely is material insofar as it offers resistance. There's that reciprocal um, um, uh, yeah. And by the bottom here, and he talks about resistance, and he talks about pressure, he talks about friction, and you get to the end of it, and he basically boils it down to, if the math, if the mass is 6 pounds and the velocity 4 units, then the force is 24. But it is the same too if 8 pounds moves with a velocity of 3 units and so on. So the calculation of force doesn't always give you what the actual like interaction that is going on is. It could be any number of things and be the same force, just different sizes. That's very interesting. So he's showing you how even if the quantitative realm is the same in two cases, you could have vastly different qualitative elements. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It's just kind of where it simplifies down. Sometimes you kind of want to focus on the simplification because it is the part that matters, but it is also a one-sided picture of the entire process.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great way to put it. Okay. Um,
Like how even physics treats time. They say it's the illusion of time, but no, time is because it continually generates nows,
yeah.
not the end result.
Yeah. And so he goes on. He talks about, so 266. He says this weight concentrated as intensive magnitude into a point of the body itself is its center of gravity. But the characteristic of a body as heavy is to posit and to have its center outside itself. Consequently, thrust and resistance, like the motion produced by them, have an essential basis and a center common to and lying outside the separate bodies. And the contingent motion externally communicated to them passes over into rest in the center. At the same time, because the center is outside matter, this rest is only an effort to reach the center. So I'm thinking of like, so you set a body in motion and it affects my physics is not strong.
Because the
How,
center,
how heavy something is affect, like if you throw a ball and it's only so heavy, its mass is going to affect how far it goes before it rejoins just gravity itself and starts falling, right?
well, that's because it's the center of the system, right? Kind of like the center of the Earth Sun
Yeah.
system, sort of thing.
Yeah. The picture that Hegel gives, and this is skipping ahead quite a bit, but the picture that Hegel gives of the motion and the center of gravity is that both, like say you have two billiard balls and one hits the other, right? And so the one that's been pushed into motion by the other billiard ball, right? Its motion is not actually outside gravity, but a part of gravity.
It's like the sum total again, not
Yeah.
which
Like when you shoot a gun and eventually the bullet falls to earth, we're used to thinking of the gun which set it in motion and its thrusting of the bullet and the gravity that eventually captures it on the ground as two separate processes, two separate things. And Hegel in this section or in the next section basically says they're both part of the same thing because mass and weight dictate how an object moves, and that's its gravity. Gravity is immanent to the mass, and as such, affects its motion. Which is different, I think, from how Newton put it, but I couldn't tell you. I think Newton probably looked at it as two different problems, but
yeah,
I could be wrong about that.
and of course nowadays we do kind of see it this way because we're just able to abstract out the fact the mass of the Earth and mass of the bullet are so different. It might as well the mass of the bullet might as well not matter too much
Right.
in terms of this center problem that is.
Yeah.
So it's effectively like it's coming from outside.
Right. But for the bullet, its center of gravity, its center is the same whether Earth is pulling it down or the gun is pushing it forward.
Yes, it's the sum
Yeah.
total of all the of at the same time, which is why in physics we have the sum total of forces as an
Yes.
external representation of that.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. For those watching, we're kind of playing fast and loose with reading out everything and just sort of talking about it. So if you ever have any questions, just comment and we'll try to go back through if you like. But you probably won't because maybe one or two people will ever see this. Who knows? This is mostly for us.
Almost 20 years since my actual last mechanics class.
Nice. So, yeah. So in this remark, he starts to go into this in regard to external finite motion. It is an axiom in mechanics that a body at rest, yeah, he goes into it, would remain at rest and a body in motion would continue in motion forever if they were not made to pass from one state to the other by an external cause. This means no more than that motion and rest are enunciated in accordance with the principle of identity. Motion is motion, rest is rest. The two determinations are external to each other. It is on these abstractions of motion and rest, each taken in isolation from the other, that is based the empty assertion of a motion continuing forever. In other words, in reality, they are not held external to each other, and so motion does not continue forever, if you follow my logic. The nullity of the principle of identity on which this assertion is based has been specifically demonstrated in its place. That assertion has no empirical foundation. He's basically saying what I just said. Even thrust as such is conditioned by gravity, i.e. by the determination of following. Throwing shows contingent motion in contrast to the essential motion of falling, but the abstraction, body qua body, is inseparably connected with its gravity, and one is thus forced to take this gravity into account in throwing. So basically what we just talked about, where if you throw and then eventually gravity brings it to the earth, they're both part of the same exact process, but they're usually held apart. Motion is motion, rest is rest, and
Yeah, it's a critique of Newton.
yeah,
because he versus
and of Kant.
restating Newton's first law. But when he makes the point that Newton was basically separating out gravity from what he was describing in the first law, and Hegel was saying you can't really do that.
Isn't that so cool? Oh my God. That's it should be foundation shaking, actually, to read this. And he put it together that far, long ago. Throwing cannot be demonstrated as something separate existing on its own. The usual example given of the motion supposedly produced by centrifugal force is that of a stone held in a sling and whirled around in a circle. The stone tries all the time to fly off at a tangent, but the question is not whether such a tendency exists, but whether it exists on its own apart from gravity, as in the concept of centrifugal force, where it is represented as wholly self-subsistent, which of course it's not, right? Newton, in the same place, maintains that a lead bullet, and then he gives the Latin, which he doesn't translate. If only one could impart to it the appropriate velocity. Such a separation of external and essential motion belongs neither to experience nor to the notion, but only to abstractive reflection. He's taken Newton to town here still. It is one thing to distinguish them, to represent them mathematically as separate lines, and to treat them as distinct quantitative factors. All this is necessary. But it is another thing to regard them as physically independent existences. So basically saying even if there are several plays of forces, you have to add them up and look at the result as part of one process, not two or three, or however many, the Rube Gold, I guess if you wanted to make it like really absurd, the Rube Goldberg moves the ball around from point A to point Z and hits all of these different points. But each one of those points, all those 26 points on the Rube Goldberg, add up to a result, which is all part of the same process. They cannot be held apart. Right? Because you have to you have to start at A, hit B, hit C, hit D, so on and so forth to get all the way to Z. Because if you held them apart, it would never get to Z, I guess you could say, very loosely. But in this unending flight of the lead bullet, one is also supposed to abstract from the resistance of the air, he talks about friction, motion of the pendulum, resistance which the body encounters in its contingent motion belongs, of course, to the necessary manifestation of its lack of self-subsistence. He goes on and basically rules out anything that could be like, oh, wait, there's friction, and so, it's separate processes. No, not really. It still has to do with weight It still has to do with the motion of the throwing. And of course, gravity is essential.
Not even directly gravity, it's still directly like if it wouldn't be moving at all. If
Yeah,
it was gravity.
exactly.
And so
Exactly.
what was it? That Latin I found it stands for might go forward into celestial spaces and proceed in its motion in infinitum. So basically just goes on forever. That's what
Yeah,
it meant.
gotcha. Motu. Yeah, you're right. I took 4 years of Latin in high school. Cannot remember a single thing. It's so sad.
Wasn't even an option in my high school.
Yeah. Um, and then he gives a really, really, really long. You know what? I'm not sure if I got to falling. I didn't. I didn't. I got to the end of this last Zusatz of um, thrust. And in it, he talks about um, what does he talk about in here? He talks about the center of gravity. He talks about the one. Um, I'll just say it. It is here that gravity itself enters as the mover, as movement pure and simple, through movement determined as canceling the separation from the center. Motion here is self-generative, is motion whose determinateness in the realm of appearance is posited by itself. The first determinateness is direction, the second the law of falling. The direction is the bearing on the one which in gravity is sought and presupposed. This search is not a searching around, a vague, indeterminate wandering to and fro in space. On the contrary, it is matter which itself posits this one in space as a place which, however, it never reaches. This center is not present to itself only, as it were, like a nucleus round which matter is gathered and toward which it would be drawn. On the contrary, the gravity of bodies generates such a center. Material points in seeking each other have, in so doing, posited a common center of gravity. Gravity is the positing of such a one. Each particular mass is the positing of it. It seeks a one within itself and gathers its entire quantitative relationship to others into a single point. So he's talking about how mass relates to space time. Is that right? Basically, as gravity. Because mass generates gravity. The Earth has gravity, right? But it also falls down the gradient of space time and so creates a curvature.
Right, so it creates mass curved space-time, which then causes masses around it to fall through that curvature, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like
But
going down a hill, and except that ironically requires gravity in its picture. But
yeah. But but we're in basically after Newton's time but before Einstein's, and so this is the only way you can describe um gravity and mass relating to each other, I guess you could say. And it's a bit, I don't want to call it archaic, art I don't want to call it archaic because I can kind of see how it works. Like the center of gravity is outside of the mass, but also an inherent quality. I don't know. Other people might disagree with me or disagree with Hegel, I should say. As for myself, I'm just following along with Hegel. So, um,
I mean, that was it. Via Engel's reading of Hegel, this was at the center of Soviet debates over relativity back in the 20s and 30s,
yeah,
because a lot of Soviets resisted Einstein because Einstein drew upon people like Ernst Mach, who was very much a positivist.
Yeah.
But the fact was, Mach actually arrived at conclusions that were similar to Hegel's and similar to Engels, from a totally different starting point.
Well, here's the thing about Mach.
Something that the Soviets defenders of relativity pointed out. I mean, if you go for Engels, you could reach the same kind of conclusions that Einstein had reached from deriving from Mach.
Mach, even if he was one-sided,
Yeah.
still reached conclusions that Hegel reached, although I wouldn't so much call them conclusions as elements,
Yeah.
moments that Hegel reflected. And so of course they're going to be similar, but Mach's wouldn't be all-sided. It would just be, one-sided from one side or the other.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it goes down for readers. This last section on thrust basically starts talking about, the mass of the body, and it's striving to reach the center. Insofar as matter fixes the center and strives to reach it, and the center is a unifying point, while matter remains a multiplicity, matter is determined as coming outside itself from out of its place. Every mass belongs to such a center, and each separating mass is something non-self-subsistent and contingent in contrast to this its truth. He has a really cool description in here of a black hole. Yeah, he does. Hang on. Hang on. Talks about the cannonball.
I think you can just search, right?
Oh, he doesn't say black hole. He
Oh,
describes it.
you said cannonball, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's the cannonball part. It is imagined that if a cannonball were projected with a force greater than that of gravity, it would fly off at a tangent if it is added there were no resistance from the air. Similarly, the pendulum would swing forever if the air offered no resistance. On the one hand, the pendulum follows the direction of gravity. By raising it, it is taken out of the direction of gravity and given another determination. It is the second determination which gives rise to the oscillatory motion. It is now asserted that resistance is the principal cause of the oscillations, becoming smaller and smaller until finally the pendulum comes to rest. But the motion due to gravity and the transversal motions are related to each other, not simply as two kinds of motions. He's restating the earlier thing. The former is the essential motion to which the latter, the contingent motions, succumbs. So eventually the bullet shot out of the gun succumbs to the essential non-contingent motion, which is the gravity. Friction itself, however, is not contingent, but is a result of gravity, even though it can be diminished. I'm looking for that description of the black hole. Maybe it was earlier. I can't remember. Basically, he says that if a body never actually reaches its center of gravity, if it did, it would collapse.
Oh yeah, now I know this part.
Ah,
Yeah, it's because the Earth doesn't fully collapse in on itself because it's pressured out by mass inside of it.
yeah,
So eventually, if it could, it would basically be a black hole, which, yeah.
yeah. So, like, the surface of the Earth can never touch the center of its own gravity, and if it did, it would collapse into a singularity. I'm I'm actually looking for the description now. I'm like, you know, um, ever questing. Only questing is the objective one, is the center of gravity of a body. Every body has a center of gravity in order as a center to have its center in another. And mass is such an actual one or a body insofar as it has a center of gravity. The center of gravity is the first reality of the one of gravity, the effort in which the whole weight of the body is concentrated. For the body to be at rest, its center of gravity must be supported. It is just as if the rest of the body did not exist. Its gravity has returned into this one point. This point, as a line, each part of which belongs to the center, is the lever. The center of gravity as the middle dividing itself into endpoints whose continuity is the line. The whole is equally this one of gravity. The surface constitutes the one, but the one which as a whole has returned into its center. What is here externalized in dimensions is immediately a one. That is, gravity develops itself in this way into a whole single body. And I'm thinking the Earth, really. Mm. Mm. Sorry, I'm just sort of. Everything is reduced to forces standing in relation to each other and differing in direction and velocity. The main concern is then the result. Thus, the motion of falling, which is posited by the force of gravity, and the motion resulting from throwing are put on the same level. Yeah, and then he talks about the cannonball and the oscillations of the pendulum. Um, sorry, combination of falling with contingent motion. Throwing does not concern us here. What we have to consider here is the sublation of purely contingent motion. Damn it! I don't know. I keep looking for something that I'm not finding. Sorry, I've kind of thrown us off. So he ends this part of the lecture basically saying that throwing is the same as falling, only in a different direction, a different part of the motion. Throwing is also falling, and the motion of the pendulum is both falling and throwing at the same time. Gravity is separation and distance from itself, a presentation of itself as sundering itself into two, but all this is still external. The fixed point, the deviation from the direction of falling, the holding at a distance of the move point, the moments of the actual motion, these belong to an other. The return into the direction of falling from the motion given in throwing is itself a throwing, and the oscillation of the pendulum is the motion in which throwing spontaneously transforms itself into falling. Yeah. So that was that whole thing. Okay. Sorry, guys. I spent 5 minutes, 10 minutes looking for something that I'm just not seeing. I know I read it. I know I read it.
I know because I read that part too a while
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah. But his description was basically all but him saying this is what a black hole looks like, or what would happen if if matter caught up with its center of gravity. It's really cool. So yeah. From here, I would say next week we return to the time stream that we originally were heading towards with falling. And we should read from page 56 through to the, well, falling is really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Say it's 6 pages. Do we want to read falling and just that, or do we want to transition into absolute mechanics as well?
I mean, I was just going to read the full thing anyways, but
I don't know how long absolute mechanics is.
yeah, I think the part when we get to Kepler's law, like, I guess we should get up to the point. Let's see here of Kepler's laws, because that's including the commentary. That's pretty much like 20 pages.
Yeah. Okay. So let's read from falling up through Kepler's law on page 65. So from 56 to 65, we'll read just a simple 9 or 10 pages. And then after that, we'll start working our way through Kepler's law and the transition to physics. Sound good?
Mhm.
All right. Cool. All right, comrades, have a great night.
Good night.
All right.